Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in New York City. Gray, damp, and indifferent. The way the city gets in November when it decides you no longer deserve warmth. Inside a small diner wedged between a nail salon and a dry cleaner on 52nd and Elm, a 24-year-old woman named Sophie Cole is tying her apron behind her back, the same way she's done 6 days a week for the past 3 years. Her hands know the knot by heart. Her heart, honestly, has stopped feeling much of anything. And then the door opens. Not for a regular, not for a construction worker wanting eggs over easy. 4 men in immaculate black suits step through that door, and the whole world, her whole world, detonates. The Morning Glory Diner was not a place people chose. It was a place people ended up. The booths were the color of dried mustard and cracked in places you'd rather not look too closely at. The linoleum floor was permanently sticky near the coffee station, no matter how many times Sophie mopped it. The air always carried the same combination: burnt coffee, frying bacon, and something vaguely industrial underneath. For Sophie, it was both prison and sanctuary, depending on the hour. She'd come here at 21, desperate for shifts after her mother's first hospitalization. She'd stayed because leaving required a plan, and plans required energy she simply didn't have. Before the diner, there had been a dream: art school applications, portfolios, a specific golden-lit vision of herself standing in a Paris museum, staring up at a Monet so close she could count the brushstrokes. That dream lived now in canvases stacked face-first against her apartment wall, gathering the kind of quiet dust that only settles on things that have been given up on. Her mother's medical bills were stacked on the kitchen table instead, real, present, demanding. Sophie had made her choice the way most people do, not all at once, but one shift at a time, until the dream was simply somewhere behind her. Her regulars were predictable. There was Marcus, the foreman from the construction site down the block, who read the sports page with the focus of a man studying scripture and left exactly $1 tip regardless of the bill. There were 2 women from the law office, Elena and Joe, who came in every morning and dismantled their boss's personal life over wilted salads with a thoroughness that could have held up in court. And then there was the old man in booth 4. His name, she would eventually learn, was Arthur, just Arthur to her. He was different from the moment he shuffled in that first morning: a faded tweed coat too heavy for the season, worn trousers, scuffed leather shoes that had once been quality. He moved like he was making no promises about staying, pale blue eyes that looked straight through everything, like he'd already seen too much to bother focusing. Her boss, a perpetually frazzled man named Stan, had given her the briefing in about 15 seconds flat. Don't waste your time on the old guy in 4. Black coffee, daily special, exact change, never tips. In and out. Brenda, the veteran waitress who approached her job the way a boxer approaches a sparring session, agreed. Booth 4 should be a counter seat. He's taken up prime real estate. But Sophie looked at the old man and didn't see a nuisance. She saw a man who was entirely alone in a room full of people, a specific, aching kind of loneliness she recognized from her own 3 a.m. moments. So she introduced herself. She brought the menu. She poured the coffee. He grunted. She came back the next day and did it again, and the day after that. For weeks, he gave her nothing. And then, one morning, she watched his swollen, arthritic hands struggling with the diner's famously dull butter knife, trying to cut his toast into workable pieces. Without thinking, Sophie reached over, picked up the knife, and said softly, "Allow me." She cut the toast into 4 neat squares. For the first time, the very first time, the old man in booth 4 looked up at her. His watery blue eyes found hers, and something passed between them that neither one could have named. After that, it became a ritual. Every morning at 7:15 he arrived. She brought black coffee, she brought the daily special, she cut his toast into 4 squares, and she talked. Not because he responded, he never did, not with words, but because the silence felt less like a wall and more like a room once she filled it. She told him about the funny thing a customer said. She mentioned it was supposed to snow. She told him one quiet Thursday morning about the Louvre, about how she'd read that if you spent 30 seconds in front of each piece of art in the Louvre, it would take you 100 days without sleeping. "Can you imagine?" she said, refilling his coffee without looking up. 100 days just for art. He never replied,
But occasionally, when she cleared his table, she'd find an extra quarter beside the mug. Just a quarter. To Sophie, it felt like a standing ovation. The morning of that particular Tuesday was already wrong before it started. Sophie had managed 4 hours of sleep, having spent the most of the night on the phone with a nurse at her mother's care facility in Queens. Medication changes, shifting insurance coverage, a payment past due. She'd pinned her smile the way you pin a note to a bulletin board, with grim necessity and no real faith that it would hold. 7:15 came, then 7:20, then 7:30. Booth 4 sat empty, and a small, cold tendril of something real began to move through her chest. Arthur was never late, not once, not in 18 months. By 8:05, she'd convinced herself he was probably just under the weather. Old people got colds. Then the bell above the door rang, and the entire diner stopped breathing. 4 men in black suits with earpieces entered the Morning Glory diner the way controlled explosions enter a room, with absolute precision and zero ecology. They flanked the door, swept the space with the kind of eyes that have been trained to see threats in everything. Then a 5th man stepped through. Late 60s, silver hair, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sophie's car. She didn't have a car, and it probably still cost more. He walked directly to her, not to Stan, not to Brenda, to her, straight to her, past the counter, across the sticky linoleum, his Italian shoes making the floor look embarrassed. "Are you Sophie Cole?" he asked. His voice was the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume. Sophie's coffee pot was still in her hand. She nodded. "My name is Richard Davies. I am a senior partner at the firm of Sterling, Cromwell, and Davies. I was the personal attorney to Mr. Arthur Hargrove." The name meant nothing at first. Arthur Hargrove. Then it clicked. Arthur. Her Arthur. The man who grunted at her every morning, who wore the same tweed coat in July, who left her quarters. "Arthur?" she heard herself whisper. "Is he okay? He didn't come in this morning." Richard Davies' expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way a window fogs at the corners. "Mr. Hargrove passed away peacefully in his sleep last night." The coffee pot grew immensely heavy in her hand. Grief arrived without announcement, the way it always does for the losses we didn't know we'd signed up for. She had barely known him. He had never told her his last name, never asked hers. And yet the small, steady ritual of those mornings had become load-bearing, one of the few things in her life that was simply quietly good. Now it was gone. "I'm sorry," she managed, her voice small. "I'm so sorry to hear that." Davies nodded curtly. Mr. Hargrove was a very specific man with very specific final instructions. Your name appears in his will. If you would gather your things, a car is waiting.
She untied her apron with shaking hands. She heard Brenda hiss something under her breath. She heard Stan say, "Go on, we've got it." She walked out of the Morning Glory diner, surrounded by 4 men in black, like a woman being escorted out of her own life. The Lincoln Continental was waiting at the curb, long, black, its engine a low, composed hum. As she slid into the back seat and the door closed behind her, she looked back at the diner through the tinted glass, small, stubborn, lit up against the gray sky. She had a feeling, electric and terrifying, that she would never see it the same way again. The offices of Sterling, Cromwell, and Davies occupied the penthouse of a building that made the Morning Glory look like a footnote. Marble floors, art in the corridors, views of the city so clean they looked like photographs. Sophie, in her jeans and worn-out sneakers, felt the weight of every other person in that building, their suits, their certainty, their ease in spaces like this. She was led into a boardroom with a table long enough to park a car on. 2 people were already seated at the far end. The man was late 20s, slicked back hair, a designer suit pulled slightly too tight across the shoulders, and the particular scowl of someone who considers inconvenience a personal insult. The woman beside him was polished in the way of people who have never had to be anything else. Davies introduced them. Miss Diana Hargrove, Mr. Caleb Hargrove. Caleb looked at Sophie the way people look at something they intend to dismiss and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is who we've been waiting for? A waitress? Grandfather's really gone and lost it." Richard Davies began to read. Legal language, trusts, endowments, numbers that sounded less like money and more like mythology, sums that belonged to other people in other lives. To Diana and Caleb, the will confirmed the Hargrove Family Trust had already contractually set aside $10 million each. Caleb nearly came out of his chair. $10 million! The company's worth billions! Davies answered without looking up. Your grandfather liquidated the majority of his personal assets over the last 2 years. What he did with his own money was his own prerogative. Then Davies paused. He looked directly at Sophie. His voice dropped into the silence of the room like a stone into still water. And finally, to Miss Sophie Cole, the young woman at the Morning Glory Diner who showed an old man kindness when she had no reason to, who treated him with dignity when others saw only a nuisance, and who, without fail, cut his toast because she noticed his hands trembled. $250,000, immediate transfer. A number that reordered the universe as Sophie understood it. Her mother's care facility bills, her debt, gone. All of it. And then, the diner. The Morning Glory Diner, purchased 6 months ago through a subsidiary, was hers. Stan, pale and speechless, would later confirm it. He'd sold to a company called A.H. Holdings, thinking it was a developer. He'd been working for Arthur Hargrove without ever knowing it. And attached to the diner, a private investment portfolio, carefully managed, currently valued at $5 million, to ensure the long-term viability of the business. Caleb's laughter died in his throat like a match in the rain. Because Arthur Hargrove hadn't left his granddaughter his art collection or his empire. He had left it, the real thing, the irreplaceable thing, to the woman who cut his toast. The key Arthur had included opened the door to his private study in his Park Avenue penthouse, a space so removed from the rest of that pristine museum-like apartment that it felt like finding a heartbeat inside a marble statue. Books floor to ceiling, a worn leather armchair angled toward a fireplace, the ghost scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, and covering one entire wall, a corkboard, floor to ceiling, dense with photographs, stock charts, legal documents, colored strings connecting points in a web that only one mind had fully understood. This was the real Arthur Hargrove, and he had been managing an empire from this chair for decades. But at the center of that web, at the very heart of all that power and strategy, was a small, blurry photograph of a woman laughing on a checkered blanket in a park. Beautiful, warm, luminously live. Beside it, another photo, the same woman standing proudly in front of a small storefront. The sign above the door read, "Ellie's Eats." The newspaper clippings told a story in fragments. Restaurateur Eleanor Hargrove killed in a car accident. A corporate predator named Vance had swept in, acquiring the bankrupt restaurant chain in the aftermath. And then, years later, Hargrove Global announces hostile takeover of Vance Industries. Sophie stared at the board for a long time. Eleanor was his wife. She was a creator of small, warm places where people could feel human. She died, and someone had profited from her death, and Arthur had spent years making that man understand his mistake. Then Sophie found her own photo, candid, taken from a distance. She was outside the diner on her break, head down, smiling at her phone, unaware of being watched. And beside it, in Arthur's shaking hand on a small slip of paper, she has her heart. Sophie sank into the leather armchair and wept, not for grief exactly, for something more like being known. But Arthur wasn't finished. With the key had come a letter, and with the letter, a single stock certificate for 1 share of Hargrove Global Holdings. The note read, "Sophie, knowledge is power. This share gives you the legal right to attend the annual shareholder meeting next month. Caleb will be there. He will try to seize control of the board. He thinks you are nobody. Prove him wrong. Everything you need is in this room. Your friend, Arthur." The weeks that followed were a kind of parallel education. By day, Sophie ran the diner, gave the whole staff raises, bought a new coffee machine, fixed the air conditioning in a single afternoon with a phone call that cost Brenda her best excuse to quit.
By night, she sat in Arthur's study with Davies as her reluctant tutor, learning the language of power. Shell corporations, proxy battles, board compositions. She read Arthur's private journals, his observations on business, his grief, his careful dismantling of Caleb's resources over the final 2 years. Arthur had seen it coming. He had prepared the battlefield, and now he had handed her the map.
The morning of the shareholder meeting, Sophie stood in front of the mirror in Arthur's penthouse bedroom wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit arranged by Davies's personal shopper. Her hair was back. Her hands were steady, steadier, at least, than they had any right to be. Davies appeared in the doorway. Arthur would be proud, he said, and she believed him. In the lobby of Hargrove Global Tower, Caleb was waiting, surrounded by his allies, radiating the specific confidence of someone who has never seriously considered losing. He saw her. His face cycled through shock, amusement, and contempt in about 2 seconds. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, loud enough to carry. "Come to serve coffee, sweetheart?" Sophie's voice found its steadiness the way it always did when something truly mattered. "My name is Sophie Cole," she said, "and I am a shareholder." She didn't tell them about the money. She didn't lead with the documents. She told them about the Morning Glory Diner, about the corner booth by the window, about a quiet old man in a tweed coat who came in every single morning at 7:15 and never said a word, about noticing his hands shook when he reached for the salt, about the toast. The room, that room full of analysts and board members and institutional investors, went completely, carefully quiet, because a story is still the most powerful thing in the world, and they hadn't heard a real one in a long time. Arthur Hargrove spent his final years, Sophie continued, not acquiring companies. He was looking for one thing: character. And Caleb Hargrove's character is documented right here. Davies stepped forward, placing folders before the chairman. $30 million lost on a failed tech venture, $2 million in personal gambling debts paid off by his grandfather, and Arthur's own handwriting, a note from his private journal that Davies read aloud. "My grandson has the ambition of a king, but the judgment of a fool." He didn't leave the empire to Caleb out of spite. He left it elsewhere out of duty, to protect it from the one person he knew would burn it down. Caleb's face moved through red into something closer to white. "These are lies, slander." Sophie didn't raise her voice. "The documentation is in front of you."
And then Sophie played her final card. She wasn't there, she told them, to simply tear Caleb down. She was there to honor Arthur's actual vision. Arthur hadn't wanted another king on the throne. He'd wanted stewardship. She looked at George Ellison, the CEO, the quiet, capable man Caleb had labeled stagnant. Arthur's journals praised Mr. Ellison's caution, his stability, his loyalty to the company's core mission. He believed in him. She turned back to the board. "Therefore, as a shareholder, I propose the creation of the Hargrove Legacy Foundation, funded by 10% of annual profits dedicated to supporting small businesses and educational scholarships. And I nominate myself, Sophie Cole, owner of the Morning Glory Diner and Arthur Hargrove's chosen heir, to run it." A silence settled over the room. Then one of the oldest board members, a man who had known Arthur for 50 years, began to clap, slowly, deliberately, and then the room joined him. Caleb's motion was crushed. Sophie's proposal passed unanimously. In the months that followed, the Morning Glory Diner was renovated. Clean lines, a new kitchen, better light. But Booth 4 was left exactly as it had always been. The cracked mustard vinyl, the scuffed edge of the table, the worn spot where an old man's coat sleeve had rested for 18 months. A small brass plaque went up on the wall. Arthur's Corner. Stan became the highly paid general manager. Brenda, who had watched Sophie with suspicion for months, waiting for the other shoe to drop, became head of staff and stopped making the word boss sound like an insult. The Hargrove Legacy Foundation funded its first round of small business grants within 6 months. Sophie hired 2 art school graduates to help run the administrative side. She finally had time in the evenings to paint again. Arthur Hargrove had everything. The apartment above Central Park, the Monets on the wall, the empire that bore his name, and he had spent his final years sitting in a cracked vinyl booth in a diner on 52nd Street, drinking black coffee, eating the daily special, looking for something that none of it had been able to give him. He found it in the woman who noticed his hand shook. He found it in the 4 neat squares of toast. He found it in 10 minutes of someone's genuine, unhurried attention on a Tuesday morning when she had 100 better things to do. He had searched for a reflection of his wife, and he found instead something rarer, a stranger who chose to be kind with nothing to gain from it. Sophie Cole didn't just inherit a fortune, she inherited a question Arthur had carried alone for decades. What is the right thing to do with what you've been given? She is still answering it, every single morning in a diner on 52nd and Elm, where the coffee is always fresh and booth 4 is always open, and where, if you look closely at the wall above that corner seat, a small brass plaque reminds anyone who cares to read it that the most important things a person can leave behind are not measured in dollars. We pass them every day, the quiet ones, the ones who shuffle in wearing coats too heavy for the season, who don't make eye contact, who sit in the corner and seem to be looking right through everything. We assume they have nothing to offer us. We assume they don't notice. Arthur Hargrove noticed everything. He just needed someone to notice him back. Not his name, not his empire, not what he could do for them, just him, an old man, trembling hands, toast in 4 squares. Who are the silent Arthurs in your life? And do you have the grace, the simple, unhurried grace, to notice them? If this story moved you, take a moment to share it. Leave a thought in the comments about what you would have done in Sophie's place, and subscribe to Whispering Lens for more stories that prove the most extraordinary things happen to the most ordinary people, if only they show up every morning and choose to be kind.
For more videos, please subscribe, like, and comment.